Hey there, and welcome to a quick video thing for this year's Mario Day. I guess this might be an annual thing we're doing now, I guess we'll see. I know I've been a little occupied for the past month or so. If you haven't heard, you can just see the last text post I made here on the channel, so I won't get into that here. I've had multiple video scripts in the works since the beginning of the year, but for now, here's a literal thing of interest that I haven't really seen a lot of people cover here on YouTube. So, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. I don't think I have to tell you that this is a great game and a perfect swan song for the SNES. Here is the North American SNES cartridge, which should be familiar to most people. SNES carts in general are not very common to find in Hong Kong at all. This copy here I actually picked up from the Portland Retro Gaming Expo last year, and a loose cartridge generally goes for around 30 to 40 US dollars in the US, which, you know, isn't super bad for a great game. On the other hand though, this is the Japanese copy of Yoshi's Island for the Super Famicom, so this has a completely different look since the Japanese box art is directly based off of the storybook aesthetic of the game, and the Japanese title is different as well, being Super Mario Yoshi Island, or Yoshi Island as it was often romanized. And yes, like every single Japanese retro game compared to their US counterpart, loose carts for this one are like dirt cheap. They're between 10 to 20 US dollars at the very most. What can I say, collectors are clamoring for the alphabet. So now, here is a third copy of Yoshi's Island, and tell me if you spot something off. No, this isn't a PAL copy of the game. I actually don't own one of those, even though it has the game's English name on a Japanese and European style cart. Instead, this cart has the Super Famicom logo on it instead. Yeah, so this is currently one of, if not the only known game that was released for the Super Famicom in Hong Kong specifically. Now, this is the part where I have to bring up that 5 years ago I made a video about Nintendo's history within Hong Kong, and how there's been a mix of both official releases and imports in the region. I do recommend checking that out. I think most of that video is still accurate, but there are a few new things I've learned since making that video that I've placed in a pinned comment as an addendum. For a quick summary though, the SNES was officially released twice in Hong Kong. First an NTSC system under the Super Famicom name, then later on as a PAL system under the Super Nintendo Entertainment System name. It's a little bit confusing since Hong Kong has a history of using both NTSC and PAL standards. However, while the console itself was officially distributed, the games you were expected to buy for it were mostly official or unofficial imports. The only currently known game that was specifically released for the Hong Kong version of the Super Famicom is Yoshi's Island. And as a bonus fact, the Taiwan version of the Super Famicom also got a release of its own, a Chinese version of Romance of the Three Kingdoms Free, making it the only known Super Nintendo game officially released in Chinese. But jumping ahead a little bit, this copy of Yoshi's Island is sadly not in Chinese. So yeah, as you may have guessed, this version of the game is not easy to come by, to say the least. The only video on YouTube that I can find that actually shows off the cartridge is a blurry video from 2012. I did mention its rarity in my Nintendo in Hong Kong video, but to this date there are still people out there lucky enough to occasionally stumble across these cartridges in the wild, including a local collector who has generously lent me this loose cartridge for the purpose of this video, so a quick thank you to Maurice for making this possible. In fact, he actually also owns a complete in-box copy of the game, which he also gave me the chance to unbox on camera. So here it is, the first, I think, full unboxing of the Hong Kong version of Yoshi's Island on YouTube. The outer packaging is definitely one of the most fascinating parts, as it looks pretty similar to the US version, with the main exception being the Super Famicom branding, which is very weird to see on a box art template like this. The box even goes out of its way to clarify that it's not compatible with the SNES and contains English instructions inside. Inside the box, it also has its own instruction manual and precautions documentation, all with the product code YIHKG printed on the corner. The precautions documentation is mostly the usual, but it actually mentions not just the Famicom and Super Famicom, but even puts their Western names next to them. I guess it sorta makes sense because the NES and SNES both saw their own releases in Hong Kong as well, but it's still funny to see both terms get mentioned in the same sentence. Next up we have the actual manual, which just like the box is mostly the same as the US version, just with all mentions of the SNES changed to Super Famicom instead. Actually, there is one change to the actual contents of the manual. In the control section here, they actually bothered to switch out the North American SNES controller with a Super Famicom one. It's actually also different from the Japanese manual, which just uses a drawing instead of a photo. So that's pretty cool, but then literally 2 pages later they forgot to change out a mention of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, so oops. As far as I can tell though, the rest of the actual contents of the manual are pretty much the same as the North American version. And then we have the cartridge itself, which the one in this boxed copy in particular is in really good condition actually. The label artwork is more similar to the PAL version than the US version this time around, as both PAL and Japanese games share the same cartridge shape. But most notably though, the cartridge labels have the product code SNSN, which is a unique product code. In comparison, the Japanese version uses SHVC, the North American version uses SNS, while the PAL version uses SNSP. Well, actually, turns out the SNSN product code is also used for the previously mentioned Taiwan release of Romance of the Three Kingdoms Free, and also the console and cartridges for the Korean variant of the Super Famicom, known as the Hyundai Super Comboy. So yeah, SNSN appears to be the designated product code for miscellaneous Asian regions, and I suppose pretty much all of the things with this product code on them are now pretty sought after. Now I actually want to open this cartridge up to show you all what's inside, but to do that we'll have to jump cut back to this loose cartridge here that's in slightly worse condition, a little bit of a scuff on the label, but otherwise it's like a 6 out of 10 in terms of condition. So let's open this up and we'll actually compare the contents to the Japanese and US copies I have here while we're at it. Alright, so here we have the insides of the Japanese, US, and Hong Kong versions respectively, and they're actually all pretty similar to each other, just with some very minor variations on how the boards and chips are labeled that I'm probably too underqualified to explain. You can see here though that on the Japanese version the ROM chip is labeled as SHVC-YI, while the US and Hong Kong versions both have SNSYI on the chip. The one seems to also denote that this is one of the later revisions of the game. And while I don't have a PAL cartridge with me, the ROM chip on that one would have said SNSP, just like the cartridge label itself. Which all of this does seem to imply that the Hong Kong version here just basically contains the US NTSC version of the game inside. But you guys probably want me to actually try this game on the Super Famicom to double check, so let's go ahead and do just that. Alright, here we go. Welcome to Hong Kong Yoshi's Island, or as you probably expected by now, and judging from the English text, yeah, this is basically just the US English version of the game. So, there's nothing too crazy to expect here, but hey, look, there is actually a save file on here. Someone, whoever owned this cartridge last, actually did play the game all the way through to World 6, and yeah, pretty much went all the way to the end, to the final level. They didn't unlock the bonus levels, which we can take a look at the score. Yep, those are scores. Didn't really bother to, like, 100% complete the game, I guess, but, yeah, all the levels are done. And if I go into the first level, yep, 60. Yep, that is definitely just a regular old playthrough of Yoshi's Island. I guess we'll just hop in 1-1, but, you know, the rest of the game is what you expect. There's nothing really special or anything different about it. And actually, just to double check it further, I did plug this cartridge into the Sony card reader, which is the open source cartridge reader, to dump the cartridge data and the save file, and it did end up, after doing the checksum on the cartridge data, it did end up telling me that it's basically just revision 1 of the US version of the game, which is what we gathered from looking at the PCBs earlier. So yeah, it is basically just Yoshi's Island, completely perfectly playable, just that it's in a Super Famicom shaped cartridge. It plays on a Japanese console just fine on my Super Famicom. Yeah, basically it's an English version of the game that plays on Japanese consoles, so, you know, that's pretty much it. I will at the very least make my way through to the end of the level, and we'll totally get that single flower right at the go. Yep, nope, okay. Yeah, that's about it for playing the cartridge. The rest of this thing is just exactly the same as the final game. It's just that this is for Hong Kong, so Americans are not allowed to play this, it's illegal. Actually, the one funny thing about this being the exact same as the US version of the game is that this controller icon right here is still using the purple color scheme that's only found on the North American SNES controller. Interestingly though, if you go in here, it actually does use the Super Famicom color scheme, but that's also the same case in the US version of the game. They just didn't bother to change these graphics for the North American version. So, yeah, I guess now this fits perfectly fine with the Super Famicom controller with the 4 colors, but yeah, that's basically it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the Hong Kong version of Yoshi's Island. It's basically just the US version at its heart, but it's still one of the most peculiar Super Famicom releases ever, and it's my pleasure to showcase it and even unbox a complete copy on here. So thank you once again to Maurice for lending me these copies. I'm glad I didn't have to spend almost $3,000 on eBay just to talk about these. Wait, what's that? I promised last Mario Day to talk about all my legal copies of Mario 64 instead. And I'll see you next Mario Day where I talk about my legal copies of Mario 64. Huh, I guess I did. Well, feel free to hand it over to the Plus channel for exactly that. Yeah, that's right, you're getting a double feature today. It's the 40th anniversary of Super Mario Bros. After all. So Nintendo, you better make this one be a banger of a year. I'm watching you.